In West Texas, the silence can kill you, but the things it hides are far worse. When a seasoned rancher unearths a truth so horrifying it shatters his world, he learns that some secrets refuse to stay buried, and some neighbors don't stay dead. Prepare for a silence that screams. The West Texas sun beat down, relentless, just as it had for Henry McCraw's 70-odd years. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light piercing the barn's gaps, illuminated like forgotten spirits. Henry, a man, carved from the same hard earth as his ranch, wiped a hand across his brow, the gesture as automatic as breathing. His calloused fingers, thick as old oak branches, spoke of a lifetime spent coaxing life from grudging soil. But lately, the soil felt like it was claiming something back. His ranch, a solitary outpost swallowed by miles of empty pasture, usually offered a peace so profound it hummed in the bones. The nights were vast canvases splattered with too many stars, making a man feel both infinitesimally small and deeply connected to something ancient. Lately, though, those nights felt too long, stretching out into an oppressive darkness that swallowed even the familiar howls of the coyotes. The trouble had started subtly, a whisper on the wind. First, one of his Hereford bulls, Big Red, was found. Not just dead, but gutted, splayed open like a sacrifice. The locals, good men mostly, murmured about rogue wolves, maybe a mountain lion driven down from the distant hills by drought. Henry, however, had seen plenty of predators in his time. He knew the clean rip of a coyote, the feral tear of a bobcat. This was different. The bite marks, where they existed, were too precise, almost surgical, as if something had meticulously carved its way through flesh and bone. And there was a strange, almost unnatural lack of blood around the carcass, as if it had simply been drained. Then another cow vanished. No blood, no tracks, just an empty patch of grass where a 1,000-pound animal had stood the night before, and another and another. Henry walked the perimeter of his land for days, rifle clutched tight, the worn wood smooth beneath his grip. He found nothing, only silence. A silence that hummed with a different kind of hunger than any animal he knew. The silence began to fray at the edges of his calm. He started remembering things he hadn't thought about since he was a boy, tucked under a scratchy wool blanket while his grandmother spun tales. By the flickering light of an oil lamp. Stories of the old ways, of the desert's true residents, things that walked on two legs but wore the skin of beasts. Skinwalkers, she'd called them, her voice low and serious, her eyes wide with a fear that had seeped into young Henry's very marrow. He'd dismissed them then as campfire tales, harmless folklore from a disappearing world. But now, standing amidst the desolation of his ranch, a cold knot of dread began to tighten in his gut. The precise wounds, the vanishing acts, the intelligent malice he felt radiating from the emptiness. It all clicked into a terrifying, impossible pattern. He told no one. What would he say? That an old man was losing his mind, seeing monsters in the moonlight? No. Henry McCraw had always faced his problems head-on, alone if necessary. So he waited. He cleaned his old Winchester, oiled its mechanisms until they gleamed, the click of the action sharp and decisive in the quiet house. He brewed coffee strong, enough to strip paint, and sat by the window, watching the last sliver of sun bleed out of the sky. The stars began to prickle through the deepening blue, one by one, like eyes opening. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of dry earth and something else, something ancient and predatory. Henry knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that whatever was out there, it would return. And this time, he would be ready. The long night had just begun. The moon, a great bleached bone in the Tadi sky, cast a spectral glow over the mesquite and sagebrush. Every blade of grass seemed to shimmer with an inner light, turning the desolate pasture into a landscape from a forgotten dream. Henry, crouched in the shadows of his barn, felt the cold seep into his bones. But it was nothing compared to the chill in his gut. His breath plumed white in the frigid air, each exhalation a silent prayer. The Winchester was heavy in his hands, its cold steel a familiar comfort, yet entirely inadequate. Against the dread that gnawed at him, hours crawled by, marked only by the shifting shadows and the distant, mournful wail of a lone coyote. Henry's eyes, trained by decades of scanning horizons, strained against the silver-washed darkness. His muscles ached, but he didn't move. He couldn't. Every sense was alive, heightened, waiting. Then he saw it. It emerged from the deeper shadows near the far fence line, not walking, but creeping, hunched and low, its silhouette against the moonlit plains. Was wrong. Too big for a coyote, too lithe for a bear, too deliberate for anything he knew. Its fur seemed to drink the light, a shifting, undulating darkness that absorbed the moonlight rather than reflecting it. And its eyes. Even from this distance, Henry felt their burning intensity, twin embers of malevolent intelligence that seemed to pierce the very night. It moved with an unsettling grace, an apex predator closing in on its unsuspecting prey. One of Henry's prized heifers, a young, naive thing, stirred uneasily in the pen. The creature paused, its head cocked, as if listening to something only it could hear. Then it lunged, a blur of dark fur and brutal force. A low, guttural, tearing sound ripped through the quiet. Henry's hands tightened on the rifle. This was no animal, not truly. He lined up the shot, his breath held, heart thumping against his ribs like a trapped bird. The creature was tearing into the heifer with a ferocity that made Henry's stomach clench, ripping flesh with a horrifying efficiency. He aimed for the leg, not wanting to kill outright, just to stop it, to get a clear look. He fired. The crack of the Winchester shattered the night, echoing across the vast emptiness. The creature shrieked, a sound that wasn't a beast's howl or a coyote's yelp. It was a scream, raw, agonized, unmistakably human. The sound slammed into Henry, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. He watched, stunned, as the dark form stumbled, limping heavily, a dark stain blossoming on its side. It turned its glowing eyes towards Henry's position, and for a fleeting moment, he felt a gaze that was ancient, filled with hatred and a terrible, calculating intelligence. Then it was gone, a limping shadow swallowed by the mesquite, disappearing into the impossibly dark night. A week passed in a state of unsettling quiet. No more cattle were killed, no more vanished. The ranch felt eerily still, the air heavy with unspoken questions. Henry barely slept, the human scream echoing in his mind, the memory of those burning eyes searing behind his own. He walked the property, finding no tracks, no trace beyond the initial bloodstain near the heifer, which seemed to have evaporated into the dry earth. On Saturday, the silence became too much. Henry drove his old Ford into town, the dusty road rattling beneath the tires. He needed supplies, but more than that, he needed the noise of other people, the illusion of normalcy. At the gas station, the pump squealing. Its protest as he filled his tank, he saw Jimmy Haynes. Jimmy, his closest neighbor, lived a good mile down the road, a solitary rancher much like Henry. Jimmy was leaning against his pickup, a bandage wrapped clumsily around his thigh. He was limping noticeably. Henry felt a cold wave wash over him like a hand closing around his heart. "Rough day, Jimmy?" Henry asked, his voice sounding strangely hollow even to his own ears. Jimmy chuckled, a nervous sound. "Ah, just a damn fool thing, Henry. Chasing a loose rooster through the backyard, tripped over an old fence post. Guess I ain't as young as I used to be." He gave a strained laugh, a bead of sweat trickling down his temple despite the cool morning. Henry didn't laugh back. He just stared, his gaze fixed on the bandaged leg, on the subtle, undeniable way Jimmy favored it. It was the same exact limp. The same side. The same spot where Henry's silver-tipped bullet had found its mark. The world seemed to spin for a moment, the cheerful chatter of the gas station fading into a distant hum. Henry finished pumping his gas, his movements stiff, mechanical. He paid, mumbled something about heading back, and drove away, leaving Jimmy standing there, oblivious. That night, back on his desolate ranch with the moon rising once more, Henry McCraw meticulously reloaded his Winchester. Each bullet, he noted grimly, had a silver tip, glinting dully in the dim light of his living room. He didn't believe in old tales. Not truly. But he couldn't afford not to. The chilling truth, sharp and precise as a surgical cut, had been laid bare. And he knew, with a certainty that threatened to shatter his very soul, that the creature would return. And this time, he wouldn't aim for the leg. 3 nights later, the creature returned. Henry wasn't sleeping. He hadn't truly slept since his conversation with Jimmy at the gas station. He lay on his cot in the barn loft, the Winchester propped beside him, its silver-tipped rounds a heavy comfort. The night was cold, clear, and quiet. A silence stretched taut as a drumskin waiting to be broken. The air hummed with an unnatural stillness. Even the coyotes seemed to hold their breath. He heard it before he saw it, a subtle rustle in the dry grass, a rhythmic scuff that spoke of deliberate, careful movement. And then, the limp. Unmistakable. The same dragging gait that Jimmy Haynes had displayed. The very rhythm Henry had etched into his memory. A cold, iron certainty. Settled deep in Henry's gut, banishing all doubt, replacing it with a grim, sickening resolve. Through the narrow slit in the barn wall, Henry watched, his breath shallow in his chest. The creature was a hulking shadow, moving with a predatory slowness towards the cattle pen. Its dark form was almost indistinguishable from the deeper gloom of the mesquite trees, but the moonlight, sharp and unforgiving, caught the occasional glint in its eyes, those burning, malevolent coals. It paused, sniffing the air, its head turning, a primeval intelligence evaluating the space. It didn't look like an animal seeking prey. It looked like a man casing a mark. His hands were steady, too steady. A strange calm had descended upon him, born of pure, unadulterated terror and the terrible clarity of his purpose. He raised the rifle, the worn stock pressing against his cheek, the cold steel of the barrel aligning with the dark shape below. He didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't about defense anymore. It was about stopping an abomination. He found his mark. Center mass. A single shot. The crack of the Winchester ripped through the night, raw and deafening. It was followed by a wet, sickening thud as the creature, caught mid-stride, stumbled forward. A choked, gurgling cry, half-beast, half-human, tore from its throat. It writhed for a moment in the dust, a dark, collapsing mass, then went still. The silence that followed was even heavier than before, suffocating. Trey dropped from the loft, landing lightly, the adrenaline thrumming through his veins. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs, each beat echoing the shot that had just been fired. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and something else, something acrid and primal. He approached slowly, rifle held ready, every nerve screaming, every instinct urging him to flee. But he couldn't. He had to see. He had to know. As he drew closer, the moonlight, pitiless and stark, revealed the grotesque tableau. The creature lay slumped, unmoving. Its fur, that shifting, light-devouring darkness, seemed to ripple. Henry froze, his breath catching in his throat. Then the transformation began. It wasn't a quick thing, not a sudden pop and shift like in a movie. It was slow, agonizing, bone-wrenching. The fur didn't just vanish, it peeled back, retracting like a gruesome skin, revealing patches of pale human flesh underneath. A sickening, wet, cracking sound filled the air, the sound of bones twisting, reforming, shrinking. The limbs shortened, the monstrous snout receded, the claws dulled and softened into fingers. It was like watching a living being dissolve and reassemble itself into something smaller, weaker, more familiar, yet infinitely more horrifying. Henry watched, mesmerized by the sheer vile impossibility of it all. His mind screamed in protest, rejecting what his eyes were seeing. The creature's form convulsed, a final ragged breath escaping its reforming lips. The last remnants of dark fur sloughed away, revealing a head of thinning, sandy hair, a familiar denim work shirt and faded jeans. Lying there in the blood-soaked dirt under the cold, judging gaze of the moon was Jimmy Haynes. His eyes were wide open, staring, glassy and vacant, fixed on the vast, indifferent expanse of the night sky. They held no hatred, no pain, no understanding, just an emptiness that echoed the one now growing inside Henry. He stood over him, the rifle suddenly heavy. Useless. Jimmy Haynes, his neighbor, the man who had laughed about chasing a rooster, now a monstrous secret bleeding into his pasture. Henry didn't hesitate for long. There was no sheriff to call, no explanation to give that wouldn't land him in a padded cell. This was his secret, his nightmare, his burden. He dragged Jimmy's body. The weight was immense, both physical and existential. He pulled him to the far edge of the property, to a secluded spot where a lone mesquite tree stood, gnarled and ancient, its branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. The ground was hard, unyielding, but Henry dug. He dug until his hands bled, until his back screamed in protest, until the first hint of false dawn painted the eastern horizon, a bruised purple. He dug a shallow, hurried grave, not deep enough to truly hide such a monstrous truth, but enough to cover the immediate horror. He pushed Jimmy in, then shoveled the dry earth back, packing it down with the flat of his spade. He scattered dead leaves and branches over the disturbed soil, a futile attempt to erase the evidence. No markers, no prayers, just silence. When he finally straightened, exhausted and covered in sweat and dirt, the sun was already a harsh, unforgiving disk in the sky. He leaned on his shovel, looking at the fresh mound. The animals stopped dying. The nights grew quiet again. A peace settled over the ranch, a heavy, unnatural peace. But it wasn't the peace of solitude Henry had known. It was the peace of a secret, buried and festering, a cold weight beneath the dust waiting. The wind would whisper and the ground would remember. And Henry, with the taste of ash in his mouth, knew that some things, once put to rest, refused to stay dead. The silence was now a constant reminder of what he had done and what lurked just beneath the surface of his world. Days bled into weeks, and weeks curdled into months. The calendar pages turned on Henry's kitchen wall, but time seemed to have stopped on his ranch, locked in an endless, watchful stillness. The cattle grazed, oblivious, their numbers no longer dwindling. The nights were quiet, broken only by the familiar drone of cicadas and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. Yet this peace was a hollow shell, brittle and cold. It was the peace of a tomb, and Henry, the sole living occupant, felt the weight of the dirt-covered secret pressing down on him, suffocating him slowly. He lived in a self-imposed isolation, his gate locked, his phone unanswered. The few times the county sheriff's patrol car drove by, a distant dust cloud on the horizon, Henry would duck inside, watching from the shadows of his living room, a phantom guilt crawling under his skin. He had buried Jimmy, yes, but he had also buried a part of himself, the part that believed in the simple, predictable order of the world. Now, every shadow held a potential form, every creak of the old house a whisper of retribution. The image of Jimmy's wide-open eyes, glassy and accusing, was burned behind Henry's own eyelids. He saw them in the flickering lamplight, in the dark patches of sleep. He had tried to reason with himself, to tell himself it was self-defense, that he had saved his herd, perhaps even others. But the human scream, the bone-cracking transformation, the sight of his neighbor lying dead in the dirt, these were truths that defied logic, truths that gnawed at his sanity like persistent rats. The quiet, once a balm, became a burden. It was too quiet. A silence that listened. Henry found himself straining, listening for sounds that weren't there. The wind, when it shifted, seemed to carry a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a rustle that was too deliberate, a dragging scrape that echoed the creature's limp. He'd dismiss it, of course, tell himself it was just the wind playing tricks. But the seed of unease was already planted, rooting deeper with each passing day. Small, unsettling things began to happen. Things that, on their own, could be explained away, but together formed a disquieting pattern. He'd leave a tool shed door latched only to find it slightly ajar when he returned. A bucket he'd left right side up would be overturned. A single, distinct boot print in the soft earth near the water trough. A print that wasn't his but too faded to truly analyze. He'd search, rifle in hand, his heart thumping like a drum against his ribs, but find nothing. Just the vast, empty plains, stretching out under an indifferent sky. Morning. He found the kitchen window usually latched tight, unlatched and pushed open a mere inch. No sign of forced entry, no broken glass, just a subtle, almost playful trespass. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Was someone playing with him? Or something? He began to sleep with the Winchester across his lap on the porch swing, watching the stars. The nights grew longer still, each one a vigil against an unseen, undefined threat. The line between paranoia and reality blurred until it became invisible. Was he just an old man, alone too long, succumbing to the creeping tendrils of guilt and isolation? Or was there truly something out there, something that knew, something that remembered? Sometimes he'd catch a faint, acrid scent on the wind, a smell like old blood and something else, something wild and ancient that he couldn't quite place. It was fleeting, gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving him breathless, his senses straining, searching for a source that never materialized. He began to wonder if the creature he killed, if Jimmy had been alone, if it was just one of many, or worse, if a part of what he had shot, what he had buried, had somehow endured. A consciousness, a spirit, a fragment of that monstrous malice, lingering, waiting for its moment. The ranch, his sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The silence that had once cradled him in its embrace now felt like a shroud, a constant low hum of malevolence. He had killed the monster, yes, but had he truly stopped it, or had he merely stirred something far older, far more terrible from its slumber? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Henry sat on his porch, the rifle heavy on his lap. A gust of wind swept across the plains, whispering through the dry grass. And in that whisper, for the first time, he heard it clearly. Not a human voice, not an animal sound, but a low, guttural chuckle that seemed to ripple from the very earth beneath him, a sound filled with dark amusement. He gripped the rifle tighter, his knuckles white. The silence of the plains had been broken not by a scream, but by a sound far more chilling. The buried secret was stirring, and it wasn't content to stay buried. The chuckled whisper in the wind that night had left Henry cold to his bones, a lingering echo that vibrated in the silence of his ranch. It wasn't a sound of the natural world, nor of a man. It was something else, something old, aware, and deeply malevolent. The subtle disturbances had escalated, shedding their ambiguity. This wasn't paranoia, this was a deliberate, chilling game. He'd woken one morning to find a single dried mesquite thorn branch laid precisely across the barrel of his rifle, which he'd left on the kitchen table. It was a plant that grew in abundance on his land, yet this one felt placed, a dark flower on an instrument of death. Another time he found a small pile of polished river stones arranged in a perfect circle outside his bedroom window, each stone cold to the touch even under the midday sun. They were not from his land. He hadn't seen such smooth, dark stones for miles around. It felt like an offering, or a warning. The stench, that acrid mix of old blood and something wild, began to linger longer, particularly at dusk, as if a presence was drawing near, testing the boundaries. It wasn't the smell of a carcass, but a more subtle, yet pervasive scent of primal rot, a raw and unsettling odor that prickled the hairs on his arms. Henry had begun to feel a new kind of gaze, Not just the emptiness of the plains, but an active, intelligent observation. He'd be working in the barn, and a sudden, sharp drop in temperature would tell him he wasn't alone. He'd spin around, rifle raised, only to find the same empty air, the same dancing dust motes. But the feeling persisted, an unseen eye following his every move. One sweltering afternoon, while checking a fence line near Jimmy's unmarked grave, Henry almost missed it. Half buried in the sun-baked soil, exposed by a recent gust of wind, was a small, crudely carved wooden idol. It was no bigger than his thumb, shaped like a stylized, hunched figure, half man, half beast, its head thrown back in a silent, elongated scream. He picked it up, feeling a profound chill despite the heat. It felt ancient, the wood worn smooth with age, yet the carvings were distinct, unsettling. It wasn't Jimmy's. It was too old, too specific. It whispered of a deeper, more ancient root to this horror. He took the idol back to his house, placing it carefully on his workbench, as if it were a venomous snake. His mind raced, pulling at forgotten threads. The stories his grandmother told, they weren't just about a skinwalker. They were about a people, a secret society, a dark lineage, those who chose to walk the night. She'd spoken of the old ones, of the first turners, of places where the veil between worlds was thin. But he'd dismissed those details as the embellishments of a storyteller. Now the idol felt like a key. He remembered an old, dusty book tucked away in the back of his grandmother's trunk, a collection of local folklore and forgotten histories, written by some amateur historian from the city decades ago. It was a book Henry had scoffed at in his youth, full of quaint superstitions. He dug through his own attic, the air thick with dust and memories, until his fingers brushed against a worn, leather-bound volume. Echoes of the high desert, forgotten tales and peculiarities of West Texas. He brought it downstairs, wiping off the layer of time. His heart pounded as he flipped through its brittle pages, searching for anything that resembled his nightmare. He found it. Buried deep within a chapter titled The Shadowed Paths, there were sketches, crude but chillingly familiar. Hunched figures, eyes like coals, the very outline of the creature he'd shot. And then, a single, terrifying paragraph. It spoke of the shifting ones, an ancient evil woven into the very fabric of the plains, not just individuals, but a lineage, a dark current flowing beneath the sun-baked earth. It detailed rituals, symbols, and a chilling concept. That when one of them fell, if their spirit was not properly contained or if their kin were near, another would rise, or a greater, more primal evil would be drawn to the disturbance. And sometimes, it whispered, they did not stay dead, but were merely dormant. A new kind of dread bloomed in Henry's chest, colder and more pervasive than anything he'd felt before. This wasn't just about Jimmy Haynes, or a single monster preying on his cattle. This was something vast, something ancient, something that transcended a single bullet, a single grave. Jimmy had been a pawn, perhaps, or merely one link in a chain that stretched back through generations, a chain Henry had now unwittingly severed, and in doing so, had drawn unwanted, far more powerful attention. The idol on his workbench seemed to pulse with a faint, unseen energy. The book lay open, its words a dark prophecy. He looked out the window at the familiar, desolate landscape, and it no longer felt like his. It felt like a stage, set for an ancient, ongoing play of terror. He had thought he was a hunter. Now he knew, with a certainty that threatened to crush him, that he had merely become the hunted. And whatever was coming next wouldn't be a limping beast. It would be something far more intelligent, far more insidious, and it would be coming for him. The silence outside was no longer just watchful. It was pregnant with a promise of retribution. The crude idol on his workbench, the brittle pages of the old book, they weren't just objects anymore. They were anchors dragging Henry deeper into a world he had fiercely, desperately refused to believe in. The shifting ones, a lineage, a disturbance. He had not merely killed a beast. He had struck a blow against something ancient, something with roots. Buried deeper than any mesquite tree in the plains, the faint chuckle he'd heard on the wind returned, not as a whisper, but as a low, throaty hum that vibrated through the very foundation of his house. It was in the walls, in the floorboards, in the air he breathed. The scent of old blood and wildness was no longer fleeting. It clung to the very fabric of his home, a constant, sickening perfume. Henry tried to cling to the mundane. He mended a fence, fixed a leaky pipe, chores that usually grounded him, but his hands trembled, his mind racing. Every shadow outside the window seemed to coalesce. Every distant sound became a deliberate approach. The sun, once his ally against the night, now felt like a spotlight, exposing his vulnerability. He was poring over the book again, tracing a faded illustration of a man with eyes like a coyote's, when a new, chilling detail snagged his attention. A small footnote, barely legible, described a binding ritual, a dark pact made with the land itself, ensuring that a fallen skinwalker's essence would return, finding a new host or, failing that, bringing retribution upon the one who spilled its blood. The desert claims its own and avenges its children, whether man or beast, it read, the words a cold caress down his spine. Jimmy hadn't just died. His death had created a vacuum, a disturbance that the land itself, or something connected to it, was now seeking to rectify. That night, the humming intensified. It wasn't in his head. It was real. It came from outside, from the very air, a low frequency that vibrated through his teeth. Henry sat by the window, rifle across his lap, every nerve taut. He saw shapes, too vague to confirm, darting at the edge of his vision, just beyond the reach of the porch light. They were faster than anything he'd ever seen, mere blurs against the darker night. And then, a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom, walking with a strange, unnatural grace. It was taller than Jimmy. Leaner, its movements fluid, almost serpentine. It did not limp, but as it moved, the humming grew louder, a deep, resonant sound that made the very glass in his window pane vibrate. Its eyes, even from a distance, glowed with an intensity that dwarfed anything he'd seen in Jimmy. These weren't coals. They were twin furnaces, burning with an ancient, terrifying malevolence. It stopped at the very edge of the porch light's reach, just beyond visibility. Henry couldn't make out its features, only, its form, a man-like silhouette, too tall, too thin, too still. And then a voice. It wasn't a scream or a gurgle. It was a low, resonant murmur that seemed to fill the air around him, a voice that spoke in a language Henry had never heard, yet understood on some primal level. It spoke of betrayal, of broken pacts, of a debt to be paid. It spoke of Jimmy, not as a victim, but as a sacrifice. And it spoke of Henry as the perpetrator, the trespasser. You broke the silence, the voice resonated. Not with words, but with feeling. You disturbed what rests. The debt is due. Henry's hand tightened on the rifle. This was no brute beast he could simply shoot. This was something else entirely, something that spoke, something that knew. He felt a chilling certainty that this was not a replacement but an enforcer, and it was here for him. You buried him, the voice continued, laced with a cold amusement that turned Henry's blood to ice. But you cannot bury the pact. His essence calls. It binds us to this land, to this blood, and now to you. A horrifying realization dawned on Henry, so terrible it stole his breath. The book, the idol, the escalating incidents, they weren't just signs of a lurking threat. They were pieces of a larger design. His shooting of Jimmy hadn't ended anything. It had initiated something. He hadn't just killed a skinwalker. He had been drawn into their ancient, dark covenant. The new entity took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another, easing into the circle of light. Its form began to shimmer, its outlines wavering like heat haze off a desert road. Henry saw glimpses, elongated fingers, a flash of something too sharp for teeth, skin that seemed to shift between human and hide. It was not fully transformed, but caught in a terrifying in-between state, showcasing its power, its control. "You are now part of the exchange," the voice hummed, closer now, filling his ears. "The land remembers. The blood calls. What was taken must be returned, or a new vessel must be found." Henry understood. They weren't seeking revenge for Jimmy's death, not in the human sense. They were seeking to complete a cycle, a dark ritual of replacement and perpetuation. Jimmy was gone, but his essence was not. And now Henry, as the catalyst, was intertwined with it. He wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for his very soul, for his humanity. The figure stepped fully into the light, and Henry's breath hitched. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in simple, worn ranch clothes. His face was weathered. His eyes, while burning with an unholy light, were chillingly familiar. Not Jimmy's, but eyes Henry had seen before, in old photographs, in faded memories. Eyes that mirrored his own. A terrifying truth colder than any desert night slammed into Henry. The figure was not a stranger. It was a distant echo, a shadow from his own lineage. He recognized the bone structure, the set of the jaw, the very shape of the eyes. This was not just a skinwalker. This was kin, a relation, an ancestor, perhaps, or a forgotten branch of his own family tree, one that had embraced the darkness. "The pact runs deep, Henry McCraw," the voice, now clearer, eerily similar to his own, resonated. "Deeper than you know. You ended one life. Now the debt must be paid. Your own or another to take your place. A new vessel. For the blood calls, and the plains demand their due." The figure raised a hand, not in aggression, but in a gesture of dark invitation. Henry was caught in an impossible bind. His own life, or the unbearable thought of someone else being dragged into this ancient, monstrous cycle. The peace had been a lie. He had merely opened a door, and now the true ancient horror of the plains had walked through it. His blood, it seemed, was bound to this land, and to the creatures that stalked it, and he had just been invited to pay the price. The figure stood before him, fully illuminated by the porch light, and Henry. McCraw felt the universe tilt on its axis. It wasn't Jimmy, not exactly. It was a man, yes, but twisted, too gaunt, too tall. His skin stretched taut over sharp angles. And his face. It was a grotesque mosaic. Features that were undeniably Henry's. The same strong jawline, the same deep-set eyes, even the slight curve of the nose, yet overlaid with a predatory sharpness, an ancient, alien malice. It was as if his own reflection had been warped in a funhouse mirror, then given the eyes of a hungry wolf. "My name is Elias," the figure rumbled, the voice a chilling echo of Henry's own, yet deeper, resonating with a primeval power. "Your great-grandfather's brother, the one they said vanished into the desert generations ago. They called it consumption or going wild. We call it becoming." Henry staggered back, bumping into the porch wall, the Winchester suddenly feeling like a child's toy in his trembling hands. His great-grandfather's brother, the forgotten ghost of his family. Tree? The man whose name was only ever whispered, usually with a shake of the head or a pitying glance. This was beyond the old tales. This was his blood, turned to poison. Jimmy. He was a late bloomer, Elias continued, a cruel smile stretching his unnaturally wide mouth, revealing teeth that seemed a shade too long. A weak vessel. But the plains, they are a crucible. They demand strength. He had been chosen years ago, but resisted. His fear kept him from fully taking the form, kept him from the truth of what we are. Your shot, it merely hastened what was inevitable. It released his essence. The air crackled with a malevolent energy, making the very hairs on Henry's arms stand on end. Released. His essence, Henry managed, the words catching in his throat. Yes. Elias took another slow, deliberate step, his eyes fixed on Henry, burning. The pact, Henry, is simple. Blood for blood, life for life. When one of us truly dies, when their spirit is not called back to the fold, when their essence is set adrift by a violent act, the land demands compensation, a new vessel, a new binding. You killed a nascent brother, and now you are the closest kin, the strongest link in the bloodline near the disturbance. Henry felt a cold dread, deeper than anything he'd known, seep into his bones. You want me? Elias chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that scraped against Henry's sanity. No, Henry. The pact wants you. The ancient spirits of the plains, they are demanding their due. And I am here to facilitate, to guide you should you choose to join us, or to ensure the transfer should you resist. The ground around Elias's feet began to shift, the dry earth rippling as if alive. A low, guttural moan rose from beneath the surface, a sound that was both earth and agony. Henry felt it in his chest, a deep vibration that threatened to loosen his very teeth. Jimmy's essence, Elias explained, his voice chillingly calm. It yearns for completion. It yearns for form. It is searching, Henry, and it is drawn to you, to the blood you share, to the land you disturbed. As he spoke, something began to push up from the earth near Elias's feet. A dark, skeletal hand, fingers gnarled like roots, slowly, agonizingly, broke through the dry soil. It was impossibly thin, yet undeniably human, caked with dirt. And then another. Two hands reaching, clawing their way out of the ground. Some secrets don't stay buried, Henry, Elias murmured, his eyes alight with a terrifying glee. And some neighbor, they don't stay dead. The hands belonged to no ordinary corpse. They moved with a disturbing, disjointed life. The soil around them cracked, revealing glimpses of a dark, glistening mass beneath, flesh that shimmered like crude oil, bones that looked too sharp. The faint, putrid smell of the grave mingled with the acrid scent of the skinwalkers. Henry raised his rifle, aiming directly at Elias. "Stay back," he growled, his voice raw, shaking. "I won't let you." Elias merely smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "You are trying to fight what is inevitable, Henry. What has been chosen, what has been demanded." As the words left Elias's lips, the ground beneath Henry's feet also began to stir. A faint vibration, a subtle tremor that climbed from the earth up through his boots and into his legs. It wasn't a natural earthquake. It was a conscious, deliberate movement. The hands from Jimmy's grave now clawed deeper into the earth, pulling with a terrible strength. The ground ripped open, and a figure began to rise. It wasn't Jimmy Haynes, whole and recognizable. It was a monstrous parody. Patches of human flesh, pale and sickly, were interspersed with matted fur the color of dried blood. Bones protruded at unnatural angles, and one eye socket was empty, a dark void, while the other held a milky, unseeing orb that was disturbingly familiar. A low, wet gurgle escaped its throat, a sound of unspeakable suffering and rage. This was the manifestation of the essence, the horrifying, incomplete return of Jimmy's spirit, warped by the skinwalker curse and the disturbance of its unnatural death. It was the pact made flesh, a creature of both man and beast, forever trapped in a liminal horror. Henry fired at Elias, a desperate, reflexive act. The silver-tipped round slammed into Elias's chest with a sickening thud. Elias staggered back, a look of surprise, then cold fury, flashing across his face. A black, viscous liquid welled from the wound. Not blood, but he didn't fall. He began to shimmer, his form becoming indistinct, like smoke in a strong wind. "Fool!" Elias's voice echoed, fading as his form began to dissolve. "You cannot kill what is already bound to the land. The debt will be paid. The cycle will be completed." As Elias's form dissipated into the night air, the creature rising from Jimmy's grave let out a guttural shriek, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony and malevolence. It lunged towards Henry, a horrifying mockery of Vio. His neighbor, its clawed hands reaching, its mismatched eyes fixed on him with an unnatural hunger. Henry, in a desperate, last-ditch effort, spun and fired, not at the abomination directly, but at the earth itself, aiming at the very spot where Elias had stood, at the place where the ground was still convulsing, at the heart of the ancient pact. He emptied the Winchester, silver-tipped rounds tearing into the soil, creating divots, spitting up dust and small rocks. He screamed, a primal sound, of a man breaking, fighting against the impossible. The creature from the grave faltered, its shriek turned into a gurgle, its movement slowing. As the last silver round hit the earth, the ground around the unearthed horror vibrated violently, then seemed to close around it. The dust swirled thick and blinding, and when it cleared, the creature was gone. The grave was still open, but the monstrous form was gone, swallowed back by the unyielding earth. Silence returned, a silence so profound it was deafening. The only sounds were Henry's ragged breaths and the frantic pounding of his own heart. Elias was gone. The thing that was Jimmy was gone. The air no longer thrummed with a low hum, nor did it carry the scent of rot. Henry stood, shaking, the empty Winchester heavy in his hands. He looked at the disturbed earth, at the gaping hole where Jimmy had been, where the creature had risen. He stumbled over, grabbed the shovel, and began to fill it in, mechanically, desperately, until the earth was flat and undisturbed once more. He poured concrete over the spot, then hauled a massive, flat rock over it, a silent, desperate prayer that some secrets might, finally, stay buried. The sun rose, painting the plains in hues of orange and gold, as if nothing had ever happened. The ranch was quiet again. The cattle grazed. The coyotes howled their usual lonely song. Henry sat on his porch, watching the vast, indifferent landscape. The Winchester was across his lap, loaded, but now with ordinary rounds. The silver was gone, all of it. He knew Elias was right. He had not killed the pact. He had merely perhaps delayed its completion. He had disturbed something ancient, something that called to his own blood. Every time the wind shifts, he listens. Every time the coyotes go silent, he watches. Because out in the desert, some secrets don't stay buried. And Henry McCraw, now a keeper of an impossible truth, knew that the blood of the plains ran deep, and that sometimes what dies doesn't stay dead, it just waits. And he would be waiting too, forever.